Now that the David, spelled d4vd case is officially going to trial, there's another part of the story that I want to have a conversation about. And the question I keep coming back to is how this situation was able to continue for so long. Why did nobody stop David? Although the situation is more complicated than any of us could ever understand, we do know one thing. There's a victim, and her name was Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And her family actually reported her missing. They reportedly attempted to limit her communication with David, spelled d4vd, personally known as David Burke. Law enforcement eventually went directly to Burke and informed him that Celeste was 13 and had been reported as a runaway. But despite those interventions, prosecutors alleged that Burke continued communicating and having a sexual relationship with her. Evidence presented during the preliminary hearing also showed that David Burke's connection with Celeste was not completely hidden. Members of Celeste's family knew that she spent time with David, and her parents actually signed a travel consent form allowing her to travel to London with him in 2024. Her adult sister also knew that the pair was together during a Las Vegas trip. Celeste was also filmed sitting with members of David's family in a VIP box during a concert at the Fonda Theater in Hollywood. The central question, therefore, is not whether anybody knew David and Celeste were connected. The question is what the different adults around them understood about that connection and why none of the interventions permanently separated Celeste from David. So this is how David and Celeste actually first ended up meeting, right? According to the LAPD detective Corey Farrell's testimony, he basically stated that David and Celeste first connected online back in August 2022. Now, David at this point was 17 years old, Celeste was 11 years old. And although both were legally minors at that moment, there's obviously an age and developmental difference between an 11-year-old and a 17-year-old, and that's very substantial. So court reporting does not establish that their relationship immediately became sexual when they first connected. Their messages began discussing sexual encounters more than a year later, shortly after Celeste turned 13 and after David had turned 18. And then this Detective Farrell, testified that the messages between David and Celeste began discussing sexual intercourse in late 2023. And at this point, Celeste was 13 and David was 18. Now, according to this detective, the messages discussed past sexual encounters, possible future encounters, and their plans to eventually meet. Now, investigators also recovered sexually explicit photographs involving David and Celeste from David's phone. Now, prosecutors rely on those messages and images as evidence supporting the charge of continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14. And during the preliminary hearing, the defense introduced messages in which Celeste allegedly claimed to be older than her true age. However, law enforcement later directly informed David that Celeste was in fact only 13 years old. Now, there are a lot of messages in this particular case right here that were brought up during the preliminary hearing for anyone who's following it between David and Celeste, where they were discussing missed periods, pregnancy, paternity, and an abortion that she had in early 2024. And Detective Farrell testified that the messages indicated Celeste became pregnant while she was only 13 years old, and David Burke asked Celeste whether the pregnancy was his, and then Celeste responded that it was. And then during that exchange, David referenced advice he said his mother had given him about questioning paternity if he ever found himself in that type of situation. One message revealed that David's mother knew that sex was part of the relationship. So basically, when Celeste asked whether his mother knew, David allegedly replied that she believed sex was the first thing they would do when they first saw each other. And of course, that detail matters because it suggests their sexual relationship was not completely hidden from the people around him, and that's very important. Now, later messages indicated that Celeste underwent an abortion in January of 2024. The messages indicated that during that time, Celeste appeared to be trying to make sense of the decision by telling herself that neither of them was capable of caring for a baby. In one of those messages, Celeste asked David whether the abortion was, in quotation marks, for the best. That wording may suggest that she wanted reassurance from him rather than feeling completely certain about the decision. Keep in mind, she was only 13 and processing a pregnancy and abortion. David appears to have been one of the main people she was turning to while trying to understand what was happening. That may have made the situation more emotionally complicated because the same person connected to the pregnancy was also the same person she may have wanted reassurance and support from. By that point, Celeste's connection to David was no longer based only on communication or spending time together. The connection was now tied to a pregnancy, an abortion, and a decision she may have believed the two of them had gone through together. That matters because when the adults around her later tried to separate them, they were not necessarily interrupting something Celeste experienced as casual or temporary. They may have been trying to pull her away from the person she associated with one of the most serious experiences of her life up until that point. We of course cannot know exactly how Celeste understood that bond, but the messages suggest that David had become part of how she was processing the situation itself. So by the time other people began stepping in, the relationship may already have carried an emotional weight to Celeste that was not obvious from the outside looking in. Now, this is when we get to February 2024, where Celeste was reported missing. So Celeste's family reported her missing to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department in February 2024. Investigators identified a telephone number associated with David Burke in Celeste's phone records. And then the Riverside County investigators, they basically contacted this phone number, which belonged to David. According to prosecutors, David said that he had last communicated with Celeste around February 13 or February 14. And he also claimed that he did not know that she was a minor or that she had been reported missing. Reportedly, this was on the phone, okay? And the Riverside County authorities requested that Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies conduct a welfare check at this place that David Burke was living in, which was in Los Angeles. And then deputies went to the Los Angeles area home where David was staying on February 17, 2024, and that interaction was recorded on body camera and later played during the preliminary hearing. Now, during the recorded interaction, David actually ended up telling the deputies, "She told me she was 18. He also acknowledged, "Everybody's telling me she was 13. And then one of the investigators testified that Burke was informed that Celeste was 13 and had been reported as a runaway. And this is one of the most important moments in the timeline. Before the welfare check, David Burke could argue that he relied on statements Celeste made about being older. And after the welfare check, after he had been informed of her true age by law enforcement, he couldn't really deny it. So deputies were at his residence because Celeste's family had reported a 13-year-old child missing. Okay, and from that moment, David knew that law enforcement identified Celeste as 13 years old. So this is what they told him, right? Now fast forward to February 19, 2024, and Celeste actually returns home. Her return showed that the missing person intervention produced an immediate result. And she was back at home. David, at this point, he knew about her age, okay? This is very important. So according to the prosecution's account, however, communication between David and Celeste continued. Prosecutors said that Celeste's parents attempted to prevent her from continuing to communicate with or see David. Their efforts reportedly included taking away her phone, and the prosecutors alleged that David subsequently found another way to restore communication with her. In other words, this is what happened, okay? Prosecutors basically alleged that David paid one of Celeste's junior high school mates $1,000 to deliver another phone to her after her parents took away her original phone. And according to the prosecution, this allowed David and Celeste to continue communicating despite the family's effort to restrict contact. So obviously the family tried to do something, but as you'll see in a second, it was not enough. This allegation is important because it portrays David as actively bypassing a protective action taken by Celeste's parents. And also police told him like, yo, she's 13, man. And this part is really important because this is the first major checkpoint where the situation moves beyond the family and reaches law enforcement. Up until this point, Celeste's family clearly knew something was wrong. She had left home, they reported her missing, and they were trying to get her back. But whatever they had done privately had not been enough to completely remove David from her life. Now the authorities had entered the picture. They had identified David's phone number, contacted him directly, and physically gone to his residence. They told him Celeste was 13 and had been reported as a runaway. So this was a real checkpoint. For the first time, an institution with actual investigative power was standing between David and Celeste. But the problem is that they were only seeing the situation as a missing person case. They were trying to find Celeste, and when she returned home, the immediate problem appeared to be resolved. What they had not uncovered was the larger relationship behind the disappearance, the sexual messages, the pregnancy, the abortion, and the extent of David's involvement in her life. So the authorities reached the correct person, told him her real age, and temporarily helped bring Celeste home, but they did not uncover enough to permanently separate them. And that is what makes this such an important checkpoint. The system caught the disappearance, but it did not catch the relationship driving it. And what makes this even more concerning is how that encounter actually unfolded. See, deputies arrived at the expensive Hollywood residence where David was staying, searched the property, and spoke with him for several minutes. And what's really interesting is how David presented his connection to Celeste during that conversation. He claimed he had only met Celeste once in person, and police later testified that they basically left the scene believing David barely knew her. David also told law enforcement that he made music, and the interaction appeared calm and conversational. He cooperated with the search and spoke so openly that one deputy even told him he did not need to provide that much detail. And that raises an obvious question. If investigators had already traced a missing 13-year-old to this adult man, why were they telling him to explain less instead of asking more? But even after deputies told David that Celeste was 13, there is no publicly reported indication that they instructed him to stop contacting her or warned him to stay away from her. The visit remained focused on one question: was Celeste physically inside the residence or not? Once the answer appeared to be no, because they searched it, the encounter between David and law enforcement ended without investigators uncovering why the phone records of a missing 13-year-old had led them to an adult man staying at that Hollywood property. It is impossible to prove that David's career, the residence, or the way he presented himself influenced how the deputies viewed him. But looking back, the calm and cooperative nature of that interaction stands in sharp contrast to what investigators would later uncover in David's messages. They had reached the correct adult, they had told him Celeste's real age, and they had the authority to ask deeper questions, but they left without uncovering what was truly happening between them. And this is what makes the February 17 intervention by law enforcement so important, because by the time authorities entered the situation, things between David and Celeste had already gone far deeper than investigators understood at the time. Some of the communication between Celeste and David showed them discussing something called Operation Awesome. Basically, what Operation Awesome was this, right? And this is according to Detective Farrell. He said that the plan involved Celeste leaving her family home and moving in with David. And the messages reportedly discussed packing belongings and arranging the move. And then this occurred during the same general period as the missing person report, welfare check, and family efforts to restrict communication. So this was all happening around that same period, okay? And the messages show that David and Celeste were discussing more than simply remaining in contact. They were discussing how Celeste could physically leave her family and stay with him. And then David had already been informed that she was 13 and had been reported as a runaway, okay? Now, March 19, 2024, Celeste was reported missing for the second time. And this was important because it showed that whatever had happened in February had not actually been resolved. Celeste had returned home, but only 1 month later, the same pattern was repeating itself. That morning, just after 7 a.m., surveillance footage from a store in Celeste's neighborhood captured a girl believed to be Celeste walking down the street in light-colored pants and a dark sweater. The store owner later said Celeste's family came to him and asked whether his cameras had captured anything. He believed the girl in the footage was Celeste and provided the video to her family. According to the store owner, she appeared to be approaching a dark vehicle located outside the camera's view. He believed she entered a vehicle, but the footage did not clearly show the vehicle, who was inside it, or what happened after she left the frame. At 7:57 a.m. that morning, her family officially reported her missing again. Deputies returned on March 26 for a follow-up, although officials declined to publicly explain what came from that investigation. So this became another major checkpoint where law enforcement had an opportunity to understand what was happening, but based on everything investigators would later uncover, it appears that the larger situation connecting Celeste to David still had not been identified. Then, only a little over 2 weeks later, on April 5th, 2024, Celeste was reported missing for a third time. Her family contacted the Riverside County Sheriff's Department at 9:29 p.m. that night, and unlike the previous disappearances, this would become the final missing person report filed for Celeste in 2024. But the report did not lead to one single police visit and then disappeared from the records. Deputies were called back to the family's home several times over the following weeks, including on April 11, April 19, and April 20. The available call logs describe those visits as follow-ups, but the Sheriff's Department declined to publicly explain what investigators learned, what actions were taken, or whether they had developed any new information about Celeste's whereabouts. So by this point, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Celeste had now been reported missing 3 times in less than 2 months. Her family had repeatedly contacted law enforcement, surveillance footage had appeared to capture part of one disappearance, and deputies had already traced her phone records to David and visited the residence where he was staying. Yet even after all those separate points of contact, authorities still had not uncovered the full extent of what was happening between them. And according to prosecutors, after Celeste disappeared that April, she began spending significant amounts of time with David and later traveled with him to places including Las Vegas, London, and Texas. So April 5th was not simply another date in the missing person records. It marked the third time Celeste was reported missing in less than 2 months, and another point where authorities were brought into the situation without uncovering its full extent. Now at this point, Celeste was 13 and she was attending 7th grade, and Celeste's brother actually told NBC Los Angeles that family members knew she was acquainted with David. Celeste's brother also told NBC Los Angeles that when she disappeared, she had been planning to see a movie with David. So throughout 2024, Celeste continued spending significant time with David. So we've all heard about some of the trips that Celeste took with David, right? But let's talk about one of those trips specifically, London. Because Celeste was still a child at this point, so she could not simply leave the country with an adult without permission. She needed consent from her family. And according to testimony, Celeste's parents actually signed a notarized travel consent form allowing her to travel to London with David. So they signed a document allowing her to do this. And so the consent establishes that Celeste's parents knew she was traveling internationally with David and approved of that particular trip. And that detail matters because earlier in the timeline, her family had been reporting her missing and trying to bring her home. But by this point, the situation had changed so much that paperwork was now being signed to allow her to leave the country with the same adult law enforcement had already connected to her. That doesn't necessarily mean her family understood everything that was happening between David and Celeste, but it does show how badly the safeguards around her had started to break down. Law enforcement had already reached David. Her family had already reported her missing multiple times. The adults around her had already been given several chances to recognize how serious the situation with Celeste was. And yet, instead of those systems closing in around Celeste and protecting her, she kept slipping through the cracks. That includes the family system too. The people and institutions that were supposed to create distance between Celeste and David were no longer doing that effectively. And that is one of the clearest examples of why this was allowed to continue for so long. Now, on top of her family giving consent and the traveling and all that, there was a few other things. And one of them was reported by NBC Los Angeles, and this was specifically about the trip that Celeste took to Texas to meet David's family. NBC Los Angeles reported that Celeste traveled to Texas to meet David's family, and this was even in some of the earlier court documents that came out. Now, another thing we need to bring up, just so I can show you how deeply integrated she was into his life, and this is something that I mentioned earlier in the video. So Celeste was also filmed sitting with members of David's family in a VIP box during a concert at the Fonda Theater in Hollywood. And so the concert footage confirms that Celeste spent time around at least some members of David's family. And the public evidence does not establish which relatives were present, how Celeste was introduced, or what each person knew about her age. It also does not establish that every member of David's family knew that the relationship was sexual. What is established is that Celeste was not completely hidden from David's family or personal world, okay? So the people around him basically knew. So this part of the story is extremely important because at this point, it's very evident based on the evidence and based on what was reported in court that both families basically knew what was going on between Celeste and David, at least as far as they were involved in some type of way. But it does not by itself prove that the family knowingly approved sexual activity between David and Celeste. That's important. So at this point in the story, we're still in 2024. So let's talk about one of the other trips, and that was a trip to Las Vegas. And so during this preliminary hearing, they also addressed this Las Vegas trip. And Celeste has a sister, adult sister. She was reportedly in Las Vegas at the same time, and she knew that David and Celeste were there together. So she knew this. And so messages presented in court show that David and Celeste discussing plans during this period that they're going to have sex while staying at the Trump International Hotel near the Las Vegas Strip. Now, the sister's awareness of the trip does not establish that she knew about those private messages or their sexual plans or nothing like that, but it does establish that an adult member of Celeste's family knew that David and Celeste were together during that particular trip in Las Vegas. So at this point in the story, we're still in 2024, and David is interacting with Celeste's family. So there's these periods when Celeste was staying with an aunt in Los Angeles, and David reportedly came to the home that Celeste was staying at with her aunt to pick her up for dates. And then David also reportedly joined Celeste's family on a trip to Six Flags Magic Mountain. And the defense said David and Celeste attended church with members of her family on multiple occasions. Detective Farrell said that he had no independent proof that the church visits occurred. However, messages were presented discussing plans to attend church services, okay? So the confirmed interactions show that Burke was not, or David was not completely unknown to Celeste's relatives. June 2024 comes, and this is when things start to get real. So in a June 2024 text message, David suggested that him and Celeste marry the following year. Now keep in mind, Celeste was 13 at this point and David was 19 years old. And so the marriage discussions show that the relationship was being presented to Celeste as something serious and potentially permanent. Now, for Celeste, promises of marriage may have reinforced her belief that the relationship would eventually become legitimate. And at the time of that message, Burke had already been informed by deputies that she was 13 years old, so he definitely knew all this stuff, okay? Later messages show that David and Celeste were continuing to be in contact, and then it also shows, particularly, this is important, that Celeste was struggling emotionally with the abortion. So Celeste was definitely struggling very heavily with this, and she expressed anger, guilt, and regret, and she blamed David and said that she had ended the pregnancy for him, and these messages indicate that the abortion remained a source of pain and conflict between them. The pregnancy raises additional questions about what adults surrounding David and Celeste may have known about this. Now, March 2025 comes, and this is really important because here Celeste attempts to create distance between herself and David. And messages presented during the hearing showed Celeste telling David that they could remain friends online, but she did not want to continue seeing him in person. She said that she wanted more for herself than having sex and spending time together. That's what Celeste said. Now, the message showed dissatisfaction with the nature of the situation. It suggested that Celeste was attempting to create a boundary while remaining emotionally connected to David. And the messages around this time also indicated that the relationship, quote unquote, remained complicated and ongoing into 2025. Now, April 22nd, 2025 comes. Here, Celeste and David, they have a final major argument. This argument involved another girl or woman connected to David, and Celeste threatened to tell her father damaging information about David. She also threatened to end David's career and ruin his life. Now, keep in mind, David's debut album, Withered, was scheduled for release on April 25th. So he has a lot going on during this period. Now, keep in mind, David is super famous during this time. Like, I know a lot of people did not know about him, but he was popular. He had billions of streams, and he was literally about to go on a European tour later that year and whatnot, and, travel around the world and all that stuff. And so he was very popular, and he had a lot going on, okay? And so prosecutors argued that Celeste's threats created a motive for David to silence her before the relationship and alleged sexual abuse became public. So the argument occurred approximately 1 day before prosecutors allege Celeste was killed. So at this point, we know about the February 2024 welfare check, the messages, the pregnancy and abortion, the sexually explicit images, the Tesla, the evidence recovered from the garage. But most importantly, we know what? We know that people actually knew that these two were involved. Now, with that being said, the reality is that the evidence does not show that absolutely nobody tried to intervene. I mean, keep in mind, Celeste's family reported her missing. Her parents reportedly attempted to limit her from communicating with David. Law enforcement went directly to David's residence. Deputies informed him that Celeste was 13. Celeste returned home. Prosecutors alleged that David then continued communicating with her and bypassed at least some of the restrictions placed around her. And at the same time, members of Celeste's family knew she spent time with David, while some of the decisions made around her allowed that contact to continue. This is the part of the case that is so difficult to sit with, okay? It would be easier to understand if David and Celeste's quote-unquote relationship had existed completely in the shadows. You would understand if nobody knew who he was, if nobody ever saw them together, if nobody ever reported her missing, and if law enforcement had never stepped in. But that's not what the evidence shows. There were warning signs, a lot of warning signs. There were missing person reports. Her family tried to restrict the contact. Initially, that's what they tried to do. The relationship was visible enough that some members of both families had seen them together, knew about certain trips, or interacted with them in some capacity. And that is where the situation becomes more complicated than simply saying that everybody knew or that nobody cared. I think her family did care, but whatever they did, it was not enough for her to get completely separated from him. The thing about this particular story is that Celeste did not disappear from everybody's view all at once. She passed through homes, family gatherings, trips, missing person reports, welfare checks, and repeated opportunities for somebody to recognize the full danger of the situation. But unfortunately, nobody appears to have recognized the full danger in time. And that is what's so concerning. There's so many different filters, if you may, that she had to go through, and that still wasn't enough. The family system failed to fully protect her. The law enforcement system failed to uncover the full situation, and every filter that was supposed to protect her had a gap. Her family saw their daughter leaving home and refusing to let go of somebody they clearly had concerns about. Law enforcement saw a runaway child who had now returned home. And the defense did, to be fair, also present messages suggesting that Celeste had made conflicting statements about her age. So it wouldn't be fair to say that nobody stepped in, but the truth is that nobody managed to create a point of no return. There's never a moment where the contact was completely cut off, where David no longer had access to her, or where Celeste was placed somewhere the situation could not simply restart again. I mean, she kept getting pulled back into the same cycle. So I think something to take away here is you cannot only protect a child by standing in front of every bad decision for them. At some point, you have to build them up strongly enough that when you are not there, they can recognize danger for themselves. You want your child to have enough confidence, enough self-worth, and enough understanding that when somebody older tries to isolate them or make them feel like the whole world is against the relationship, they do not automatically see that person as the only one who truly understands them. Because sometimes the strongest protection is not a locked door. It is a child being able to look at the person on the other side at the door and understand why they should not open it. And that kind of strength does not appear overnight. It comes from teaching children that they can tell you the truth without immediately feeling like their entire life is going to be destroyed. It comes from building enough trust that when something feels wrong, they come toward you instead of running further into the situation. Because once fear becomes stronger than trust, a child may start hiding the exact things you need them to share with you. And that's kind of where I want to leave this conversation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace, I'm out.